Okay, picture this. It's 2 a.m. The room is totally dark. Your eyes are burning, but your thumb just keeps swiping. You're scrolling past a natural disaster, an economic crisis, maybe a violent crime, or some terrifying new health threat. You are completely exhausted, and you know for a fact this isn't making you happy, yet you simply cannot look away, right? Why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we instinctively doom scroll through terrible news late at night? Well, it feels like this modern failing, a universal human mystery of the digital age. But the truth is actually much deeper and much, much older than your smartphone.
In this explainer, we're setting out on an investigative journey to figure out exactly why we do this. We're going to explore the hidden psychological forces that keep us glued to our screens, look at how media companies actively capitalize on our biology, and ultimately figure out how we can actually break free from the cycle.
Chapter 1. The Pull of Bad News.
Look, if you've ever felt guilty for clicking on some sensational, terrifying headline instead of a heartwarming story, you should know that your obsession with terrible events isn't a modern failing at all. It's an ancient biological feature. Okay, let's dive into this. At the core of our doom-scrolling habit is a psychological concept called negativity bias. Basically, this is a cognitive bias where human cognition is relatively more affected by negative information than equally potent positive information. And from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes perfect sense. Our ancestors survived because their brains were literally hardwired to constantly scan the environment for threats. I mean, missing a beautiful sunset was fine, but missing the signs of a predator meant you didn't survive to pass on your genes. So we are quite literally the descendants of the most anxious, hyper-vigilant early humans.
Here's the thing about how we process information in our daily lives. Positive and negative traits are just not weighed equally. Psychological research shows that a single negative trait or a negative news story disproportionately outweighs positive information. Why? Well, because we have this general expectation that people and society will behave positively. Positive behavior is basically our baseline. Because of that, negative events are highly unexpected and incredibly salient. They stand out like a sore thumb, absolutely demanding our brain's immediate processing power.
And the research into digital news selection really backs this up. The findings point out that alarming threats coming from our digital environment demand our immediate processing because they have a much higher value for our vigilance and diagnosticity. What that means is, when we see a negative headline, our brain basically sounds an internal alarm, telling us we must process this information immediately to avert potential personal risks. We literally click the bad news because our brain genuinely believes it's saving our lives.
Chapter 2. Profiting from your attention.
Now, having a brain wired for survival is great if you're dodging lions out on the savannah, but it is a massive vulnerability in the modern world. Welcome to the attention economy. This is an economic approach that treats human attention as a scarce commodity. Actually, way back in 1971, a psychologist and economist named Herbert A. Simon accurately predicted the exact crisis we're in right now. He said that in an information-rich world, a wealth of information inevitably creates a poverty of attention. Because there's just so much content out there, your attention becomes the bottleneck. It is the most valuable resource on Earth.
So how exactly does this play out in the business models of today? Well, in this era of surveillance capitalism, social media and news platforms monetize our attention through a very specific three-step loop. First, they have to capture your attention. And as we just learned, absolutely nothing captures human attention faster than a perceived threat or negative news. Second, the platforms use variable rewards to release dopamine in your brain. This is the exact same psychological mechanism used in casino slot machines. Third, they maximize your engagement by serving up a customized, never-ending feed of highly emotional, often intensely negative content. They are literally hacking our evolutionary survival instincts just to keep us scrolling and to sell advertising.
Chapter 3. Enter the mean world.
But we can't just blame the algorithms of the 2010s for all this. If we trace the evolution of media anxiety, there's a really clear timeline. It really started being formally studied in the 1970s by communications professor George Gerbner with his Cultural Indicators Project, which looked at the effects of television. Fast forward to the 2010s, and this dynamic was completely supercharged by the social media boom, where content suddenly became personalized and totally inescapable. And of course, this culminated in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where the term doomscrolling officially entered our everyday vocabulary, as billions of us locked down and consumed a relentless daily stream of terrifying updates.
So, the crucial point here is how this sheer volume of media fundamentally alters our perception of reality. Just wrap your head around this number, 8,000. Back in the television era, Gerbner's research found that by the end of elementary school, an average child had already seen 8,000 murders on TV. Today, with the entire internet in our pockets 24/7, that exposure to violent, negative, and extreme events is exponentially higher.
Gardner actually coined a term for the result of this heavy exposure. He called it mean world syndrome. He noted that moderate to heavy consumers of mass media start to perceive the world as a significantly more dangerous, intimidating, and unforgiving place than it actually is. As he put it, the programming reinforces our worst fears, apprehensions, and paranoia. We slowly begin to mistake isolated, rare, highly sensational events presented in the news as our standard daily reality.
Chapter 4. Doomscrolling and Mental Health.
And listen, this isn't just some abstract sociological theory. It has real, compounding effects on our psychological well-being. Consider this massive statistic from a recent demographic study of young adults. 6.63 hours. That is the average amount of time spent daily on social media platforms by the participants in this study. Over 6 hours. And the research found a highly significant direct correlation between spending this amount of time passively consuming curated, often negative content and severe anxiety impairment.
But it actually gets even more specific than just the raw time spent. Researchers discovered this fascinating dose-response relationship. When mapping anxiety levels against the number of different social media platforms a person uses, a clear pattern emerged. Those who juggle 7 to 11 different platforms have a dramatically higher risk of severe anxiety symptoms compared to those who just stick to 1 or 2. Bouncing between all those platforms creates this fractured, totally overwhelming digital environment that our brains simply are not equipped to process peacefully.
And honestly, the craziest part, it really doesn't take long for the damage to be done. A fascinating, if kind of unsettling study by psychologists Johnston and Davey found that watching just 14 minutes of negative news bulletins significantly increased viewers' sad and anxious moods. But it gets worse. It literally made them start catastrophizing. Viewers who watched the negative news took their own completely unrelated personal worries, like an upcoming exam or a minor financial stress, and began imagining the absolute worst possible outcomes, way more so than the people who watched positive or neutral news. The bad news on the screen literally poisoned their thoughts about their own private lives. Chapter 5. Escaping the Negativity Trap.
Okay, so that is the grim reality of how our biology and modern media intersect. But how do we actually escape the negativity trap? Thankfully, scientists are actively working on this. We have the academic receipts right here from a major University of Amsterdam study. This research explored how we can break this doom-scrolling cycle, and no, it doesn't involve throwing your phone into the ocean. Instead, it focuses on using targeted news media literacy interventions. Now, a really fascinating takeaway from the research is this dangerous psychological loop tied to confirmation bias. The study found that highly pessimistic people actively seek out negative, episodically framed news just to confirm their existing bleak worldview. They get trapped in this brutal downward spiral. They feel the world is bad, so they click on bad news, which then proves the world is bad, which makes them even more pessimistic. It's a trap. But the study also proved that we can absolutely interrupt this loop.
The researchers found that exposure to specific media literacy interventions successfully mitigated this negativity bias, especially for those highly pessimistic folks. So, here is your actionable toolkit based directly on that science. First, actively recognize clickbait coverage. You have to know that a headline is specifically designed to trigger your ancient survival instinct. Second, acknowledge your own biological negativity bias. Realize that your brain is actively tricking you into overvaluing the threat. Third, remember the attention economy. Understand the very real economic motivations of the platforms serving you this content. And finally, actively choose to avoid disproportionately negative, isolated stories in favor of thematic, big-picture news that actually shows long-term trends.
Ultimately, understanding the actual science of doomscrolling shifts the power right back to you. You are no longer just a passive consumer being driven by an ancient survival reflex. You are fully aware of the game being played for your attention. So as this explainer comes to an end and you find your thumb hovering over your screen, ready to swipe, ask yourself, what will you choose to pay attention to next?